Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Danzy Senna and Mishna Wolff.
Good morning.
Hi,
Hi. So I think maybe I'll introduce Danny.
Danzy.
I'm so sorry. You look like a friend of mine named Danny. I'm off to a terrible start.
It's okay.
Danzy Senna, and uh, Danzy, why don't you tell everybody a little about your book?
Yeah, I've written 5 books, mostly fiction, and my first novel is Caucasia, which was written, it feels like, in another lifetime, about a young girl coming of age in Boston in the shadow of the civil rights movement, and her father's black, her mother's white, and she um, is sort of forced to pass as white for various complicated reasons. Um, and my new book is called New People, and is sort of a dark comedy about race. And I grew up in a interracial family. My dad is black and my mother's white, and sort of issues of racial ambiguity and identity have really preoccupied my work and been a theme underlying everything I write. Um, and the kind of comedy of race and the sort of obsessive quality to it, how it sort of never goes away and it kind of keeps reemerging, and the weight of history. Um, I also wrote a memoir, and I know Mishna has a memoir, so um, about my family history, actually, because my mother is from the largest slave trading family on the Northeast Corridor, and I traced back her history to this very famous slave trader and family of slave traders, which she was sad to have me expose. and
I can imagine that was a little.
it's like she's really liberal and
You know
comes
what,
from,
Danzy? Why don't you skip Thanksgiving this year?
yeah. And my dad's family is from like the deep South, and African American family in Alabama and New Orleans. So I traced both their family histories and looked at the sort of intersections, and my family as a kind of microcosm of American history and all of its mixture and kind of violence and tragedy and connection. So, and
And
Mishna,
yeah, I mean, I feel
jump on
like,
in.
yeah, I mean, I feel like we have a similar thing in that I grew up in a blended family. It's not an, I guess it's not an interracial family, but we were married. I was married. I grew up in a household that was, half black, half white, and it was also a predominantly African American neighborhood I grew up in, and it was also very poor. And I feel like one of the things that gets missed sometimes in these conversations about race is how much class is an equalizer in some ways. Like if you went to a big family gathering with my family, like today, right? My big blended family, you would see a lot of white people in that group that were married or had kids with people that would not strike you as out of place at all, just because they're a part of that sort of class group that I grew up with, which was, you know, at times we were way below the poverty line.
Where was this?
This was in South
Oh,
Seattle.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so I think too that that's, but both of us I feel like are in the soup.
Yeah.
It's there's nothing binary about sort of um, the feelings I had growing up and sort of my identity in that sort of way. My father deeply identified as African American, and to the point where it's like how he dressed and talked and walked and lived was as a member of this community that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because the whole class question, I grew up, the black people and the black world that I grew up in was highly educated and artists and writers, and my father's a writer, and so they weren't rich, but there was a kind of cultural wealth
Yeah,
and cultural capital
for
there,
sure.
and so I'm always interested, like when people conflate black culture with working class,
Yeah.
because it's to me there has not always been that association, like
Mhm.
what is black is not that.
Agreed.
So I have a really complex feeling about, what constitutes black culture.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say like the big issue I have sometimes with the conversation, and I feel like there is now a conversation that we've seen in the media and that we're all sort of witness to in books and film about race, um, is that it sort of conflates all white people and all black people, but one of the things I take issue with is there's only one voice in that discussion, and it's an educated, upper middle class or middle class voice, generally doing the. It's just a conversation in general because of who makes books and films and movies and all that stuff is generally a privileged voice to begin with.
Yeah, no, and I think that's true for white and black voices.
For white and black voices.
There's just going to class is the great kind of unacknowledged space in American politics. Like we love talking about race, we love talking about gender and sexuality, but like the privilege issue, when it goes down to that level of who has access to all of these things, that's
Media.
where it's uncomfortable, you
Yeah.
know.
Who has access to media?
Yeah.
When we do see someone not of privilege or see a voice not of privilege, it's usually from the lens of class tourism by a network or something, and you get something like a
Honey Boo
Honey
Boo.
Boo Boo. I was exactly thinking that.
Yeah.
Whereas
That's such
it's like, yeah.
like, and it feels horribly exploitative.
It feels horribly
Yeah.
exploited. Like
Yeah. So I was just curious, given your family upbringing and the larger family you come from, do you feel like now that you're an adult, has your life become more white or more sort of segregated than it was for you growing up? Like, how has that affected you as an adult?
I mean, I think when I was growing up, that's a really good question. And I can't really tell you, except for, my husband is white and my children are white. And I feel like that's definitely, a indicator of sort of where my feet landed. I'm a card-carrying member of the NAACP. You get great discounts with that card. No, I would say I have I don't know. It's funny because I code switch a lot, and my husband points it out that when I'm with my sister, suddenly he doesn't even know who I am, and he's like, your voice changes, like you speak like like you're back home, and when I'm back home, but it's weird. You integrate into a self that inhabits your childhood self and your adult self. And, I'm very close to my family. I have a really strong relationship with my stepmother, my nephew, her extended family. So I'm in that community. And then I wrote a book that, is well liked by my own community. So, it's hard to say, but the tough time I find is that for better or for worse, I've always looked, people have always said, oh, you look rich. You know what I mean? So I have a lot of black female friends that I feel like, when I first got to know them, they were just like, hey, why is this, rich white woman so, have all the same reference points as me and, wanna hang out. And I think, that's been not anything, but I remember when I was growing up, when I went to my school that was very white from my neighborhood, the black girls that were there initially, thought I was too ghetto, and they didn't want to hang out with me
Yeah.
because they felt
Right.
I made them look bad.
Uh-huh.
So
Right.
they were just like, "We can't with you. You're just too feral." Like,
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I have the experience of passing, which has been a real theme in my work as well. But just that thing, I think, where you walk into a room and people project a certain meaning onto your physicality, and it doesn't really acknowledge these places in you that are invisible. And so, yes,
that's really eloquently put.
but just for me, it's also that experience of constantly being seen and read as a white woman. And my husband is black, and so we're always having interracial couples try to bond with us, and I'm like, actually, we're not an interracial couple.
That's hilarious.
We're both black, and it's just, yeah, it's sort of all these awkward moments and funny moments. And like my kids, every time they have to have forms at school, the people put on the form that they're biracial. And
Really.
yeah, and my son's always like, actually, it's not quite what it seems. My older son has gotten more
That's
comfortable,
hilarious.
like clarifying. But of course, they are multiracial because black people in America are a multiracial group, and three of their four grandparents are black, but then there's my blonde wasp mother. And so it's, their also understanding of blackness is a very complex and multiracial concept of it, like where there's different shades of blackness and there's different cultural spaces. My husband's from the deep south, and I'm from what my mother calls the deep north, which is Boston.
Right.
And
But Boston is one of them. I mean, I don't know how Boston is today, but growing up, I used to visit Boston a certain amount because my grandmother lived there, and I found it to be. She lived in Jamaica Plain.
that's where I grew up.
That's hilarious.
Exactly where I grew up.
She lived right around the corner from Stan Hanoff's.
Oh my God,
that's
that's
where she
bringing me back. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I spent my entire childhood wandering those mean streets, which they called Jamaica Spain when I was growing up, because all
Really?
the Puerto Ricans lived there,
Okay.
and that was actually
This is getting a little insidery, but
no, but the like the Puerto Rican, it goes back to this subject because people assumed we were Puerto Rican because those were the families where the kids ranged in complexion from very
Right.
light to brown to kinky hair, straight hair. And so a lot of my close friends were those kids. And
Interesting.
it was this sort of gray area, middle space that I found as a child.
But I found
Yeah.
Boston to be one of the more segregated cities I've ever
Yeah.
been to.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's why I call it the deep north because, I mean, it was not an easy place to grow up as an interracial family. And the level, it's not segregated, it's straight up racist.
Okay.
It's a straight up racist
that
city.
was me being nice to
Yeah,
Boston.
no, it's like one of the most racist cities you'll ever grow up if you grew up in the time I did. And
Right.
the things that were done, to my family were, when I got to college, I lived in the black dorm and told all these kids from like Alabama and Louisiana and things that had happened to black students there, and they were like, "What?" They couldn't believe that was in the South, that was happening to someone,
In the north.
things that would never happen to them. Yeah. So, I mean, the levels of sort of extreme racial hostility were intense there, and it really formed my black identity. I didn't grow up thinking of myself as biracial. I grew up thinking of myself as black. And
Okay.
it was not an option. Like there was no form where you could have a category as a child to say mixed race.
Right.
You would either pass as white or you were black and proud. And I
Mhm.
grew up, with very politicized parents, and I am a black person who happens to pass as white when I enter a room. And now I identify more as all of these things come into my work and onto the table. But growing up, there was in Boston in that era, there was no other option.
See, my version of that growing up was I remember I was on this team, this basketball team called the Satin Dolls, and the Satin Dolls were crazy. They were they were coached by the first female professional basketball player who was on the Harlem Globetrotters. Um, but I think she was doing community service by coaching us because she had an on again, off again drug problem. So like, it's really hard to mug like, you know, an 8 balls worth of good feelings from coaching kids at basketball. Like, she was so angry. And these girls were incredible. It was like me, my dad had so many aspirations for me, and then these like,
Because you're tall.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then these girls that had just like always had a ball in their hand, and we would literally go to white community centers and win like 79-0 at 11. Like, it was like crazy. They were just like, what is going on? Like, you
Do you
have.
still play basketball?
I have a hoop.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, I have a hoop. I play a little horse.
Okay,
I play
yeah.
a little horse.
Yeah.
But I remember like the girls on my team would always try and figure out my family. Like, they'd always be like, so that's your half sister, because my sister had really curly hair and very big features, like, uh, and they would always look at her and say, so that's your half sister, and I would be like, no, that's my full sister, and they'd be like, but you guys don't have the same mom, and I'm like, yeah, we have the same mom, like, we're sisters. And then they'd look at my stepbrother and sister and say, but those are your half siblings. I'd be like, no, those are my step siblings. And I feel like everywhere we went, even if that wasn't the conversation, that was the inner dialogue people were having, was like, who by
Yeah.
what marriage is this family?
Yeah, and we were talking about how, when we were in the green room, about how invisible that kind of a family is in the popular culture still, where there's
Yeah.
all this diversity happening, where you get all these different groups being represented on television and film, and yet there's still, I think, a real lack of what we know, to be a real and true and not that unusual,
Not
actually, an
unusual at
experience,
all experience in
of having
America.
a family that's all different races, and that's all I know, and that's normal to me. So it's strange to have it be completely unrepresented in a way.
Yeah, it's the invisible family in the media.
Yeah, yeah,
And I don't know why that is. I
yeah.
can't figure it out. But
Well, I mean, there's the history of not allowing black and white people to kiss on screen, especially black man and a white woman.
Right.
But that seems like that's at least happened now, so there should be some.
yeah,
They should get married at some point
they
and
should
have
at
kids.
some point they should have children together. Yes.
I mean, Idris Elba and Kate Winslet should have a baby. And,
Absolutely.
Like, come on. After they get out of that mountain, they should
Yeah.
go have some babies.
Agreed.
So, okay. So, should we open it up to questions?
Yeah.
And
I think we should. Does anyone
Yeah.
have any questions?
yes?
You sorry.
Oh, sorry. So, the question was,
Our peers.
yeah, but the first part of the question was, and both of us? Yeah. So the question was how we were treated in both by our black and white peers in our childhoods growing up, and then how we see America in terms of the relations between blacks and whites right now. Do you want to?
Well, I feel like I had a peer group of sort of the school I went to was very upper middle class white liberal. And while I felt like I blended in physically with them, they could not understand they had no idea the world I came from, and they could not wrap their head around a community. And I'm not speaking about all communities, I'm speaking about my family, and I'm not speaking about the black community, in which education was not a priority at all. They could not even believe it. Not only was education not a priority at all in my family, but it was there was almost it just was that was them. They're not working class. there was just an attitude of sort of snottiness ascribed to, my friends' parents who worked at like nonprofits. So I just don't think they could imagine. Like I would come to school with like I would never I like never did my homework, and they like it was just this like couldn't believe it. They were like, "Well, what'd you do?" I was like, "Well, I had chores, you know." And then I had like 2 hours of basketball. And then, I had to take care of the babies and get them ready for bed. And then I went to sleep. And I feel like that was really the disconnect between me and my white peer group, was just like how we spent our evenings. And I mean, even to, like, I had jobs really early. I had to work. Just was not this, like, uh, there was no conceiving of a version of things where school just wasn't the most important thing in your life.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, that class issue that comes into, because I went to sort of scrappy public schools of different races, and um, I think one of my most formative experiences racially was of seeing the two faces of white America, because I was privy to the conversation that white people had when they didn't think there was a black person in the room, and then the conversation they had when they were being liberal, and I think I've been very aware of that kind of gaslighting of black America, where it's like, we don't see race and we don't have any racism, and we're not even noticing that you're black, actually. And then I'm in the conversation when all of that mask falls away, and that's one of my earliest experiences of race, was having that. And how did blacks relate to me? Well, there were no blacks in the sense that I only, when I look back on my life, I see very specific individuals, and I had some of my most, you know, my best friends were some of those people, and some of them were people who were bullies, and some of those were people who didn't um, embrace me. But it wasn't really about me appearing white to them when I had bad experiences in the black community. I think in the black community, there's always been a range of complexions, and as soon as I'm known to be biracial, the black community has been very accepting of who I am, and that understanding of gradations of blackness has been there from the beginning of this country. So I went to an Afrocentric school when I was 8 for a year, and that was kind of a rough experience because it was a rough school. And the people I made friends with were the black middle class children of professors and artists. I always found myself finding the people whose parents were also artists. And my best friend's father was a filmmaker. And so I think we reduce people when we talk about them as black or white. And the traumas I had, like going to a working class Irish, Boston Irish school, had as much to do with the history of the Boston Irish. I don't like to reduce people to these groups without all of these complex issues of class and cultural reference points.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for me, like, my sister made the jump from white to light, and I didn't. And just within our social group in our neighborhood, you know what I mean? And I don't think that has anything to do with the color of our skin. It's
No.
just like culturally she fit with this group, and culturally I did not.
And is she still identified as black, light-skinned, or
No,
no?
no, I wouldn't say at all. But that, I mean, that was a long journey for her, and that's her own story.
Yeah.
And she had some good experiences and some bad experiences, but I think our neighborhood was also the scene of a lot of, at the time growing up, it was a really fun place. We were super free range kids. We had a lot of autonomy and independence, and we had a lot of really fun adventures. And it was also a place of a lot of dysfunction and
Yeah.
violence. So, And I also remember a really steep jump in my community in the early 90s when crack was introduced into, sort of the whole sphere, and there was a big sharp change in the cultural, sort of feel of things.
Right.
But
Yes. Yeah. 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 Yes, the question was whether my parents politicized me growing up and if that was helpful or not helpful. And, my parents were very political and very racialized. They were both obsessed with the subject of race. They married in 1968, 6 months after Martin Luther King was assassinated in Loving versus State of Virginia. The Supreme Court decision was that, yeah, the anti-miscegenation laws were considered unconstitutional. So there was a baby boom and a marriage boom of interracial couples. So I'm part of the loving generation, that is what they call us, because we were all born from like 68 to the early 70s. There was suddenly this spike of interracial couples. And my mother wrote for Ms. Magazine. She brought us on Take Back the Night marches. She had actually framed pictures of JFK and Martin Luther King in our house. We had a lot of tenants or people coming, artists and from Africa and Latin America living in our house. And my father was writing, he wrote a book called The Fallacy of IQ about racism and standardized testing, and was constantly talking to us about blackness and history and Egypt and the origins of civilization. And I feel now very grateful for that education that I had and the books they forced me to read, and Franz Fanon and, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, things that were shoved down my throat as a child. And I do feel this ambivalence because I think they had their sort of political activist, artist world, and then we were the foot soldiers, the children, and forced to go fight these battles on this really ground level, and it was scrappy. And I do think that for most mixed people, when you're told you're just black and you're also these other things, that can be very confusing. But I also, at this age in my life, feel very grateful. And I've met a lot of mixed people in the last decade who I feel, because we are in a racist culture, it's very easy for that to sink into your pores and for you to feel shame about your blackness, because that is the identity that needs protecting and boosting in this world when you leave your house. So I get it when I meet people who didn't have that, because I had not a moment in my entire life of having any shame or anything but pride about being black. And so I think that I sort of forgive a lot of the other things when I think of what they were sort of defending me against, because it wasn't a liberal fantasy world. And I was hearing things that could have sunk into my pores, and they were giving me this armor that I appreciate at this point. Yeah. Yes, you had your hand
Are
raised.
things better now? You described Boston when you were growing up as a flat out racist
Yes,
society. I don't know whether you still live there now.
LA.
At LO, okay.
Yeah.
But just in general, where have we come in the last 20 or 30 years?
Where have we come the last 20, 30 years around
Going
race?
back to
Yes.
now,
Yeah, I
what
mean,
would be different?
it is different now. And I mean, I think it's naive to deny that certain things have changed. And I think all of those policies that the right wing has sort of demonized have been really successful in many ways, like having affirmative action and enforced diversity, like that, those were necessary steps. If you think back to where we were, but I think racism and race division is so much part of the fabric of the sort of origins of this country that it's going to kind of keep flaring up like a cancer that goes into remission. And it kind of seems to like there are all these things that are still not dealt with, like police brutality. And the reason that we talk about it now is literally only because of the cell phone. Like, otherwise, there would be that gaslighting where that doesn't exist, but somebody has a cell phone now, and we know that this has actually been happening as it always has. So I think that as these things become exposed, it kind of opens the wound again and forces us to look at it. But certainly we're at a more, I think, enlightened place than we were in my childhood. And my children are growing up in California where it's not the black-white thing. Like, their school is 60% Asian and 20% Latino. And so their conversation is not the same one, and I'm learning a lot from them, actually.
Yeah, and I would say I had a recent experience in my family that involved detectives, the court system, and it was it was a situation in which a family member was murdered, and I sort of showed up. I remember being very conscious of the fact that I was showing up to be a well-dressed white lady with my family, and that they needed a well-dressed white lady with them, and I was right, because
That's still
that's a thing, and it's a thing when you shake a detective's hand and they're like, "Whoa," and they thought I was a lawyer. They thought I was a lawyer, and I was really, or when I went and stood next to my stepmother in court. That's all I did, stand there. I had nothing to offer the situation. I do not have a law degree. I'm barely good moral support. I have to eat all the time, and I always have to go use the bathroom. Like, I'm not the best day in court with anybody. Don't bring me if you have to go. I'm always looking at my cell phone. But I knew that's what the situation needed, and I was not wrong. You know what I mean? It changed the outcomes of these days, and until you've actually had that experience, I feel like as a white person, it's just like it's mind bending. It's really mind bending. And I will also say this: I've also had the experience of just plain old. This is a whole nother thing, but just plain old being poor. Like, I remember walking into stores when I was a kid and the security guard following me around the store because it's just what I looked like. And that never happens to me anymore. And it's awesome that never happens anymore. But I do feel like being poor, or having people think you might be poor, or having people think you might be any number of things, creates a shame that is really, it sticks with you, and you bring it to situations, and an apologeticness that is not really apropos of a lot of situations. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but
Yeah, but I
okay. Right. It was a magnet program, and
you have to repeat the question.
okay. I'm sorry. She asked how I got in this great school, from um, this this sort of poor neighborhood that I grew up in, and the answer is I had a pushy parent. My mom, she was a bus driver and she worked nights and weekends, and so my dad, when they got divorced, got sort of primary custody of us. But she made a deal with him that I was going to this school, and he was not thrilled with the idea. He did not like my classmates. He didn't really like my teachers. He didn't like the other parents at the school. Um, but it was part of the deal. And he would always like sort of try and re-educate me. It was a great school. I got a great education through high school, but he would always like, it was very important that he re-educate me too when I got home. And, we'd have long conversations about bias and redlining, and, it was, it was his way of saying, these people don't know everything. But the answer is I had a very pushy parent.
Yes.
Hella came from the Bay Area too.
Yeah, that is a Bay Area slang.
Because we got your slang later. I'm from Seattle, and the slang would start in the. Did you grow up in Oakland? No,
No, I
you
grew
grew up in Boston. Your
yeah.
book is set in Oakland. I'm sorry.
Well,
The
they end up
Caucasia,
in-
that
yeah.
one is. Yeah, but San Francisco.
You have to repeat the question.
The question is, did the black kids have more power socially? I did not grow up around any white kids up until I was like 8 years old. So I spoke Ebonics. I did all the hand chants that self-identified me as a black person. I did not have the experience of really being around a lot of white kids. So yeah, they dominated socially. um, but but in a situation like that, it's more about who's fastest, who's strongest. But mostly it was about who was wittiest, who was funniest, who was quickest, who was sharpest. I have to say, like, my neighborhood didn't have a lot of opportunity, but it had a lot of creativity. And the kids I grew up around were sharp. They were really sharp kids that I learned a lot of about comedy writing, which is what I do for a living today. And I didn't learn that at my gifted magnet school. I learned punctuation.
Now the computer can do that.
Yeah,
so
now
that
the
was
computer.
useless,
Yeah,
right?
it was total.
Yeah.
It was a useless education. But
Right,
Jason, Trey, there were kids that really taught me how to be quick on my feet and use my personality and use wit and be present, and and just the value of being able to tell a good story came from them. It didn't come from anybody else, and it didn't come from my parents either. It came from the mean streets of Boys and Girls Club.
Yes. I mean, I think a lot of people remember the night Trump was elected, right? You're
Yeah.
like, where were you? I was not expecting that outcome, as most of people I was around were not, and maybe it's because I live in LA and a sort of democratic bubble, but nobody was expecting that. And I remember the party I was at, and everyone it was a celebration party. We were all hanging out, and like
Yeah.
I remember the room just getting quieter and quieter, and like that dread coming into the room, and then people just started leaving. Um, and at the same time, I think in the aftermath of that election, I did not shrink into a fetal position. I sort of, over the months that came, I was like, yeah, there's a, you know, this person in charge right now, and um, a lot of my white liberal friends like literally had nervous breakdowns, it felt like.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? I mean, I feel like Obama was the anomaly, and I was actually like, oh, this is the America I have known, and we're returning to something. And then it got, even crazier than the America I'd known. But like, I felt like I had things to draw on as a black person in America that allowed me to move forward with optimism under the era of Trump. That my friends who were, and there was also with them, I thought, a kind of horror and shame about being white suddenly that had not, that they were like really trying to show how depressed they were as a way of saying, I'm not this kind of white.
Right.
And it was like, wait, why are you going so extreme with this performance of grief? Like, just wipe off your pants and get on with it. Like, there was just a strange gap there where, like, the black world I was in, we were just kind of like, yep, yep. And then it was like,
So I had this strange experience
did you
of
have
having
that?
a very close black family member pro-Trump,
Yeah, I know. I've
where I was
one
just,
too.
but it was
Yeah.
all about his malehood.
Oh,
So
it was a misogyny
it was
thing.
like all about
Yeah.
his malehood.
Yeah.
So it was just like, yeah, he's gonna make it good for us hardworking men again.
Yeah.
To,
No, I know one
to-
person like
yeah,
that too.
and I was just really like, okay, we'll see, Go,
Yeah. No, I mean,
Um,
yeah.
I-
Hmm. Right. Hmm.
well, yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. There's this you don't understand, but do something about this. Fix this, but you don't understand. Um, thing that sometimes I feel like, um,
Well, there's a Che Guevara quote, which I'm going to get wrong, which is when the left wing, the American left, is asked to form a firing squad, they form a circle. And I think there is a lot of sort of attacking one another within that, that can be really unproductive.
yeah,
And I like to think, what is our goal? Like, what's our outcome that we want? And that was the way that the civil rights movement succeeded, was being very goal driven. Like,
right.
we want this law to be revoked. We want this decision. We want these spaces opened and these schools. And so I think when we lose sight in the sort of fever of social media in particular. I think social media has been toxic for political conversation in many ways. I think when we lose sight of actually what our goal is as a group who are trying to change things and begin to become more sort of in this narcissistic identity politics, self-righteous frenzy, we kind of lose that sense of what we're actually here to do.
And I see a hand up over there, but we're about to get cut off here. Is there something quickly? I think it's hard for people from low socioeconomic backgrounds to find a microphone. Period.
But you're
Anywhere.
also asking if people can write from another perspective.
Oh,
If you're writing from another point of view, I think if there is that risk, but I have more to say on that than I have time to say. But I think that as an artist, I'm more open-minded about these things. If you can do things well, then you can do anything.
yeah. I mean, there used to be this thing that the difference between a misogynistic joke and an edgy joke
Yeah,
is an edgy joke's funny.
right. Exactly. That's right. I think we're out of time, so thank you all.